one of the biggest challenges for most people I know in my faith, I'm not sure how, I speak to a lot of Jewish people, but a lot of people want to know God, but they don't want to read about who God says he is in the text. So there's a tendency to be so intimidated by this text that instead of not fully understanding something or getting something wrong or struggling to kind of get to the heart of what this book is saying, that you avoid it completely. And I think I look at my own faith journey, and I've got to the place as a believer that it's okay not to know or fully understand everything that this book presents, and it's not going to be as simple as I can read this once and I'm good, but it's actually something that I have to revisit over and over and over and over again. And like Abraham, like Isaac and Jacob, there is something that needs to be sculpted in me, and that requires just a life in the text. Now, as I was saying, like a lot of Christians and Jewish believers sometimes go, I really, really want to know God, but I don't feel like I have the energy to read the text.
All right.
And you're like, okay. So, and then, people will go down a whole other path of saying, I have my own personal relationship with God. That's great, but that's not how God seems to operate. It's like, you don't get to decide who he is. You get to be invited into who he says he is, and it's your choice to go and discover that or not. That's the invitation. It's not like, me and God, we have our own personal thing. He reveals to me different stuff that he reveals to the rest of humanity. But I'm like, okay.
It's not like an a la carte God. Like, this is an important book.
No, it's the most important book.
Yeah.
This is, for both Jew and Christian, we believe that God has spoken. And if you're going to take that God seriously, that comes with going, okay, well, I better see what he said. I take it or leave it. I can make my own decision whether I accept it or not. But I have to go and say, well, what did you say? I think one of the most important things for a believer is to not shape your understanding of God about who you think he is, and not who someone else has told you who he is, but rather who he says he is. And that involves a deep dive and a study of the text. Now, on that, Parashat Toledot.
My man.
That's where we're at.
Oh my God.
Toledot.
First take, Nate. You nailed it.
Parashat Toledot. Practically Hebrew. We spoke about Toledot as a word that kind of refers to as generations.
Yeah.
Why is this specific parashat referred to as Toledot? Why did they choose to name it as such?
It's a great question. So in terms of like how naming works, like how it's traditionally worked for like thousands of years, right? The English names of the book are like, the Latin names that we're all familiar with, Genesis, Exodus. They kind of like will try to sum up the theme of the book in a word or in a name. But what the Hebrew names do is they'll usually, in a simple sense, just take like the first word or the first significant word in a portion, and that's the name. So like the first word of the first portion is Bereshit, right? Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim et haaretz. So Bereshit is the name of the thing, of the portion. In this case, the first significant word is Toldot, because the first verse of chapter 23 begins with, and these are the generations of Isaac, the son of Abraham. Abraham birthed Isaac. In Hebrew, that's Elet Toldot Yitzchak, right? And these are the generations. So,
and I don't mind this genealogy because it's short and sweet.
It's quick, yeah, done in one sentence.
Yeah.
But there is a deeper meaning there, which is until now, it's been a story about Abraham. And look, how many times throughout history have we seen like someone comes along with an epiphany and a great idea, and then within one generation, it's gone, right? So Abraham being a believer is in some ways like, obviously amazing, but like, okay, it's happened throughout history. Then Abraham has a son. And as we talked about in the last episode, Isaac follows in his father's footsteps. That takes a lot of courage. But, ultimately that's all taking place within one household. Now we're about to tell the story of Jacob and Esau. We're about to tell the story of the third generation of faith. And, the verse in the Bible says, that the three-chorded string is hard to tear apart. The same thing is true for family units, that once you have 3 generations of something, now it's real. And so this is the first time that the faith of Abraham has actually survived outside of its original natural habitat. Now it's actually in someone else's house and being passed down to a 3rd generation. So that's where we begin. This story begins with, okay, now the faith of Abraham is real. How do we make it? How do we see it unfold through history? That's the case.
We've seen it successfully go through an entire generation, which was Isaac, and now we're setting the stage for this again.
We've stress tested it.
Yeah, the stress test is a pass. Now it's Esau and Jacob.
Yeah,
2 brothers. Which again, in a lot of ways, we see some similarities between Abraham's story. Even though there was 2 separate mothers for Ishmael and Isaac, we're now again seeing 2 brothers, 2 lines, 2 directions. And I guess, if you're reading this for the first time, you ask the question, well, which direction is this going to go? Knowing that the direction didn't go with Ishmael, it went with Isaac, and now we have 2 brothers from the same mother, Rebecca. Where is God going to take this story? And what does, the roles of Esau and Jacob kind of represent in the spiritual journey that God is establishing? So Rebecca goes to the Lord, and she's struggling with her pregnancy. Again, we see a relationship with Sarah. And then Adonai will say to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from your body will be separated. 1 people will be stronger than the other people, but the older will serve the younger.
I want to stop there because this is like a classic why read the Bible in Hebrew moment. So the English, like not just English, once you translate the original text into another language, so part of what translation can be amazing because it can help you take an idea and add richness to it by using the tools of another language. But what it also does is it forces you to choose. If you have a text that's ambiguous, translation forces you to choose one of the answers.
You have to go around.
Yeah. So that sentence, when Rivka asks, prays to God and asks what's happening with this pregnancy of 2 children and they're fighting, or they feel like they're fighting. Chapter 25, verse 23. And God says to her, there are 2 nations in your womb, in your womb, and 2 nations from your womb will be split. And then the next words are ul'om mil'om ye'ematz, right? And 1 nation will be stronger than the other. And then the next Hebrew words. So how does your English translate it?
But the older will serve the younger.
But the older will serve the younger. Now that's a choice, because what the Hebrew says is v'rav ya'avod sa'ir. Rav means older, Sa'ir means younger, and Ya'avod means will serve. In biblical Hebrew, there are 2 meanings to that sentence, and both of them are equally plausible. One is, and the older shall serve the younger, but the other one is, and the older one, the younger one shall serve him. Both of those readings are totally permissible in biblical Hebrew. It can either mean the older one will serve the younger, or the younger one will serve the older. To me, this is the theme of this part of Genesis, which is you can kind of read these stories and you see, go back to the beginning of Genesis. You see sin, murder, Hamas. You see the destruction of the world. You see the slavery and the hubris of Babel. You see inattention to details. You pointed out with him. You see all of these. You see all of these sins, and they're like.
I'm so curious. I want to go back because I want to make sure people get what you're saying. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you're saying that this verse, where the older will serve the younger, could easily be translated as the younger will serve the older.
Bingo, correct.
You can't.
You have no idea. The English, once you translate it into English,
you're forced to.
You're forced to choose. You can't, because there's no way to preserve. You could preserve it in English by saying the younger shall the old. I mean, there's really no way to do it. Right?
I'm amazed by that, but I'm not surprised by that.
Right? Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. If you've read the Bible,
this is, if you know God, you're like
on brand for God.
Not surprising, because what it feels like it's doing then is it's leaving it open, not only for the reader, but also for the people.
Yes.
So now Rebecca, as we call her, you call her
Rivka.
Rivka. Okay, we've learned something.
Let's go, baby.
Rivka. So we then are faced with this reality that if she's received this word from Adonai, and he said that in a way where it's like, wait,
come back, one more.
Can you clarify that? Like I kind of missed that, but that actually opens up to the possibility of now like choice.
Yes,
for the human, for Rivka to go, how do I take that?
Again, it's exactly what we talked about with Cain and Abel, right? God chooses Abel, but doesn't explain why. And there may not even be a reason, right? Or at least not a reason that we humans understand, right? But like God chooses Abel, and Cain then Cain basically says, how could you choose Abel? I'm going to murder him. God says, you have a choice. You can obsess about why this happened, or you can understand that you have free will. You have the ability to make the best of yourself and to actually fulfill your own responsibilities, have your own story. And that's the theme that's about to reemerge here. Two brothers who are going to be in tension with each other and are going to fight with each other. And what God's saying at the very beginning is nothing about their relationship is set in stone right now. Even if I'm telling you that there's certain beats of the story that are going to be filled. They're going to both be great nations. They're both going to emerge from you. But in terms of how their story develops, they can choose. That's what it means to be a creature of God created in his image.
It's actually such a fascinating thought because, as a reader who knows that it will ultimately be Jacob that will be chosen, in the moment of time, it's not as clear as, okay, so God's just had his clear. Now, God knows outside of time exactly where this story is going, but we, in this moment of time, are forced to actually ponder that reality that there is an invitation at our feet. And so every step of the way leading up until chapter 25, there is always this element that humans have the ability to shift. And that, like, although I don't know where the story is going to go, there's always something before me which I can either choose to follow in this path or go in this direction. And constantly God is being gracious in allowing humanity to be, to just be and realize that what's in front of me is a choice, which I think really kind of, I'm going to jump here, and I'm going to jump all the way to when Moses meets the burning bush moment with God, and he says, what am I going to call you? When I go back to the Hebrews in Egypt, who am I going to say sent me? And he gives a title to himself is, it's often translated, I am that I am that I am.
Yeah.
But more correctly in the Hebrew is, I will be what I will be, which means this is the moment. Whatever this moment is, that's how you need to understand it. And this feels like one of those moments where it will be what it will be. You don't really kind of know what that is, but it's present, it's active. And at this point in the story, it could go either way.
Yeah, exactly. And then we get into the actual story itself. And the most interesting thing is, like, you have these two children, and
completely different,
totally different.
Couldn't be more different.
Yeah, exactly. And for whatever reason, like, it's being set up. They're almost being set up as Cain and Abel again, right? Because you have Esau is, the verse says in verse 27 that he's a
hunter.
He's a hunter.
He's
a man of the field,
outdoors. He likes game, and
exactly. And Jacob is a tent dweller, right? Like Jacob dwells in a right.
I'm sorry. He's hanging out with his mom, cooking. You know,
He's
he's
a nerd.
he's not a man's man at this point.
Right, exactly.
At this point, he's like, you know, he's like, you know, what the yeshiva kid who goes and studies Torah, and you know, you would, you like, he's not the guy who's like, oh, you're in charge.
Yeah.
Jacob, your quarterback. You know, it's like we go with you.
Jacob's not the quarterback.
He's like, me?
Right.
It's like, what about just? I was just gonna get the water for the team or something. Like, but yeah, they're different, and that, I think that's, you know, I often use this example of the difference between Yaakov and Esau today in terms of what we're currently looking at between, you know, the Jewish way of life and the Arab way of life. Now, they're ethnicities. There is a Jewish belief, but there's also a Jewish ethnicity, and there is an Arab ethnicity, and they are very similar. They come from the same region of the world, but just as Arabs and Jews are so different, Esau and Jacob are so different that their worldview, their cultures and their customs superficially may look similar, but fundamentally they're so far apart from each other in a lot of ways. And what excites Esau is not something that excites Jacob. And what Jacob is focused on is absolutely not what Esau's is focused on. And those two worlds have a very, very difficult time trying to coexist. And it's as if they're like two ships in the night. And there's a lot of difficulty in these two cultural groups coming together. And that's often how I see it, because when, you know, I spent a lot of time in the Arab world and I spent a lot of time in the Jewish world, and they're both uniquely different worlds. And what brings an Arab culture to life is not what necessarily brings a Jewish culture to life. And what brings a Jewish culture to life and what they strive for is not what an Arab world. And I guess I've been fortunate to sit in a position where I'm neither. And I get to observe and I see, wow, you guys are so radically different. And I often refer to the Jacob and Esau example as two brothers, but radically different. And the way that they may communicate and operate with one another sometimes has challenges and difficulties just like this.
And I think what's so interesting about that is it's not just different personalities, but each of those personalities, because they're different, each one has to like develop and ripen in some way.
Now, why do I say two nations? Like, you know, when I talk about Arabs and Jews, well, you know, here in the text, you know, God says there's two nations in your womb.
Yeah.
Two groups. And that's kind
of bigger than just this story.
Yeah, it's bigger. And it's like, yeah, they might be brothers, but
right.
Get ready for it.
Yeah.
It's going to be a ride.
And so the question we have to ask ourselves as we approach this text is, okay, we have these two characters. They're radically different, and they represent two stories that are going to continue for generations. What's the starting point for each? Because the starting point for each is going to help us determine what each one's challenges and opportunities are as we move forward. So like, take Esau. So here's something we learn about Esau that may actually be unique in the Bible. So if you look at chapter 25, verse 34, the very end of the last verse in the chapter. So after Jacob purchases the birthright, whatever that means, we'll come back to that in a second. After Jacob purchases like the privilege of being the oldest from Esau. So and he does it by, you know, trading him basically a bowl of lentil soup for the birthright.
Good deal.
Right, exactly. It's a good return on investment. That's how you know Jacob is Jewish.
Right.
So Jacob gives to Esau. So the verse says Jacob gives to Esau bread and lentil soup. And then it tells us what Esau does. And this is like Esau to a T. It says, and he ate and he drank and he got up and he walked and he went on his way and he despised and Esau despised the birthright. So if you're reading that in Hebrew, all of that is In Hebrew, that's Vayochal, Vayesht, Vayakom, Vayelech, Vayivez. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's 5 verbs in a row. This actually might be the only time in the Bible where you have 5 verbs in a row describing what a person is doing, like 5 action words. Esau's just like an impetuous man of action, just does stuff and doesn't think about it, right?
He's living in the now.
Yeah, he's living in the now and just
he's
instant gratification.
Yes, the desires of my flesh are the paramount priority of my life.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's the Esau challenge. What about the Jacob challenge? So the Jacob challenge you can see in this story also. Because think about it. What's Jacob trying to do, right? Esau comes and he's hungry and he's impetuous. And Jacob says, okay, listen, we have different values. You value instant gratification. I value the long term. I want that birthright. Like I want to be the oldest. Now, so he says, I will trade you the thing that you want now for the thing that I want for the future. And in a way, this is the perfect story to illustrate what Jacob was like as a child, because this is sort of the immature version of what Jacob will ultimately grow up to be in a beautiful sense. But you can see Jacob's challenge right here. Jacob's challenge, if I had to sum it up, was thinking you can hack salvation.
Cheat the system.
Yeah, you can cheat the system. Meaning Jacob's like, okay, the oldest, the oldest is the one who gets the birthright. So I'm gonna buy being the oldest. Like, think about that. I mean, like, I'm trying to think about my kids. Like, if one of my daughters said to my oldest, like, hey, I'm gonna trade you for $500, I want you to make me the oldest kid. That wouldn't work, right? But Jacob thinks that you can hack salvation, right? And Jacob, and this will be a theme as we go through, I mean, even the next chapter, or rather 2 chapters from now, when Jacob tries to get Esau's blessing, right? So like Jacob's kind of underdeveloped theory of life is that like you said, you could cheat the system. Like I'm going to get Esau's blessing.
And where do we first see a cheating of the system?
Yeah.
It's the Genesis story of Adam and Eve, where it's like, this is the tree of knowledge and good and evil. Sure, you can maybe do the long haul, get to know God and find out what he really cares about. Or just grab that fruit, take a bite. It's instant. Your gratification is there. It looks good. It seems right. Why not go for it? And so we even see in Jacob's story that default setting of human nature going, well, if this is good to have knowledge and understanding, or if this is good to have this birthright, why not just go for what harm could I be causing?
Exactly.
Yeah. And clearly Esau doesn't really help the situation because he doesn't want it.
Right. Esau's like, take it, man.
Yeah. Like, I don't care about that.
But as Jacob grows, you see this becomes Jacob's great strength, because what is Jacob doing? Ultimately, Jacob is saying, I am not going to focus on the short term. I'm going to care about the long term, because ultimately I want that relationship with God. I want my family to have the relationship with God, because Jacob is the archetypal character in the Bible, and particularly in Genesis, who thinks about the future. He's the one who's, even as a kid, is investing in his future.
I mean, Jacob is...
And that's, by the way, that's why of all the patriarchs whose children ultimately become all chosen, not just one chosen and the other, it's Jacob, because Jacob's the one who's thinking about the future. It's not a mistake that Jacob's children are the ones who all carry on the legacy.
And so that's a real key, right? Like, if we go to the last prophet of the Jewish text, which is Malachi, we come across this interesting conversation that God seems to have with Israel, right? And it says, a word of Adonai to Israel by Malachi. He says, I love you, says Adonai. But you say, how do you love us? And then God says, was Esau not Jacob's brother? It is a declaration of Adonai. Yet I loved Jacob, and Esau I hated. I made his hills a wasteland and gave his inheritance to jackals of the wilderness. And so that's always an interesting verse. Now this will continue on as God has this dialogue with Israel, declaring his faithfulness to this nation. But what we see is that God loved Jacob and God despised Esau, which will ultimately become like, so much more in the broader sense when we think about Jacob. But here's what it is. Jacob has a value in the generational future, which is an ultimate characteristic of the God we believe in, because we believe in a generational God. So Jacob has the making of someone who could truly understand and pursue the character of God because he already has this desire for something generational, whereas Esau is only caring about the here and now. And so even looking at the text, it's like, why does God choose a certain people like Jacob? Because even though in this moment of time we can go, oh, Jacob's like, he's a trickster, right? That's what Jacob means, a trickster. He's always trying to get his way. And so I think it lends to the sovereignty and the foreknowledge of God, where he says, you see him as this right now.
Yep, exactly.
But I know what he can become.
Yeah.
Given the right time and right challenges, I actually know what he becomes. And this is important for all of us in a moment of time in our lives, where so often if I looked at myself 7 years ago and I considered myself a Christian,
Right.
I'd be like, oh, wow, I was not there at all. And even though in my own mind, I thought maybe I'm kind of there, looking back now, I'm like, I was not even close. And even prior to being a Christian, there would have been a lot of people who would have written me off as a human being because it's like, oh, you live this lifestyle, you do this and that. And what I love about God is he doesn't necessarily look at us as in the right now. He's actually so forward thinking that he's like, well, this is what you are now, but I've got a journey that I'm taking you on. And by the time I'm finished, I know what you'll become. And that's why I think God can be in love with a people, not because of who we are, but what we can ultimately become in him. And Jacob really puts that on display in the book of Genesis. We're going from a homebound, mama's boy kid who's being deceptive in his attempts to get some sort of thing that will kind of benefit him. But ultimately God goes, yeah, that's you now, but there's going to be a whole process, and what you ultimately become is what I love. And that only happens because of the things that I see now that I can actually draw out of you, which is, again, this idea of like, generational is important.
Yeah. And if you think about like the best, like the most influential people in your life, the people who like really saw something in you, it's always people who are able to recognize that
potential.
Yeah, exactly. You can see past your weaknesses and find your strength. And that's what God does for us, right? So I remember I was in high school, the best teacher I ever had, a Hasidic rabbi, amazing teacher. And there was, one time in class, early in high school, where he was saying something I didn't agree with, like I really, really disagreed with. And so I kind of spoke up, and I was pretty rude. And I started like getting all hot and bothered. Now, a worse teacher would have, yelled at me or sent me to the principal or whatever it is, or kicked me out of class. I'll never forget, after class, he came up to me privately and he said, I take it you disagree with me, but having an opinion is a privilege, not a right. And if you want to disagree with me, you need to read more. And so he said, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to buy books for you that support your opinion, that I disagree with, but support your opinion. If you read them, we'll talk about them together and let's have a conversation. Never to this day, I still have those books. He bought those books for me, read them. And what I used to do is I used to very frequently cut class. Like I would just skip class, but I wouldn't skip class to like go see a movie. I'd skip class to go to the teacher's lounge and just argue with him and talk about books and not that I'm like a great guy or anything, but he was able to see that the strength in me was that I was curious. I don't have a lot of strengths, but that is one. And this teacher was able to see that even though I was both rude, immature, and skipping class, he was able to see that underneath those
there was something beautiful that could be drawn out.
There was something there. To this day, I will be eternally grateful to him for that kind of thing. And that's what you're seeing in this text on a much grander scale and with a much greater person, obviously. But God's able to see that underneath the trickster, underneath the
deceptive nature, and and it's not all his fault as well. Like, I'm not to say
he's also sitting here with like a crazy bully,
and we see favoritism in both parents, Isaac and Rebecca, that they have a favorite son.
Right.
You know, like Isaac clearly is like, well, I'm team Esau because I like love the food and, you know,
Yeah.
I'm hungry and, you know, he's a good hunter. And Rebecca is obviously gunning for Jacob to gain these things, so much so that she even pushes him into a situation which you and I would be like, well, that's not really the right thing to do, you know, pretending to be your own brother to get the blessing. But we see the broken nature of these characters kind of playing out once again. We saw it with Abraham, we saw it with Sarah, we're seeing it now with Isaac and Rebecca, and we're seeing how God is being faithful in working with and I think that's what makes Genesis such an amazing book. He's not working with perfect people.
Yeah.
And what a fascinating text this
These
would
aren't
have
like
been.
mythological heroes.
No. Could you imagine like the ancient world going, oh, can I read some of your Torah? And they're like,
these guys? Really?
these are your heroes?
Right.
Like these are the people that you're choosing to.
That was the biblical revolution. The heroes were real people. Yeah. And by the way, the other crazy thing is like, if you think about like, how does this whole like you're talking about the favoritism, right? Isaac has one favorite, Rebecca has another. There's a moment, there's actually a really powerful moment in the text. So it's in chapter 25, verse 21. So the English is, and Isaac, I mean, I'm curious what yours has, but I'm just translating from the Hebrew. And Isaac prays to God. How does your verse translate? How does yours translate?
Isaac prayed to Adonai on behalf of his wife because she was barren.
Okay. So that phrase that's being translated on behalf of his wife in Hebrew is lenochach ishto. The ishto means his wife. Nochach in Hebrew usually means it could mean in the presence of his wife. Definitely doesn't mean on behalf of his wife. It could mean in the presence of, like, they're translating it that way because they want to make sense of it in English. Again, this is a translator, just has to make a choice, right? But what lenochach, so the ancient rabbinic tradition picked up on this anomaly here, because the word nochach usually means opposite, or like in front of, or on the other side of,
right? Like face to face,
or not even face to face, but like opposite from each other. So what the rabbinic tradition says is it conjures up this image. Again, it's imaginative, it's whimsical. It conjures up this image. It says that when Isaac and Rebecca were both praying for children that they would have together, he prayed in one corner and she prayed in the other. They weren't praying. They weren't joining forces together.
Which reflects in the children.
Exactly. And that it was that lack of communication. And it's that lack of communication that produces a lot of the problems that arise. Because at the end of the day, I mean, think about it. What's the blessing that Jacob wanted and that Rebecca wanted for Jacob? Ultimately, it was the blessing of Abraham, right? Meaning it's the blessing that God bestowed upon Abraham.
Who was still alive when they were young boys.
Yeah.
So obviously someone sat on Abraham's lap and was like, oh, that's pretty. So wait, what did this God say? That we're going to get all this land? And
and by the way, that's the blessing. I mean, the blessing that God gives to Abraham, that Abraham gives to Isaac, and then Isaac is going to give to somebody else. It's a consistent blessing. It's a blessing for land, and it's the blessing of the land and children, right? That's the blessing. You look at every single place it appears in the Bible, that's always what it is. So what's the blessing that Jacob wants and that Esau thinks he's going to get and that Jacob wants? It's the blessing of Abraham. Now, Rebecca thinks that she has to trick Isaac into giving the blessing to Jacob. So what does she do? She contrives this whole scenario where Jacob dresses like Esau and Isaac is blind, so he doesn't realize. But if you actually look, what's the result of that? The result of that whole thing is that when Isaac thinks that Jacob is Esau, so we're now in chapter 27, verse 27. Isaac had said to Jacob in the previous verse, it's in verse 26, it says, and Isaac his father said to him, come close to me and give me a kiss, show me a sign of love. And so he comes close to him and he kisses him, and then Isaac smells the sweet smell of his clothing and he blesses him. And what's the blessing? Now remember, the blessing of Abraham is the land and children, right? What's the blessing? The sweet smell of my son is like the smell of the field that with which God has blessed him. May God give him may God give him
the dew of the sky.
Yeah, the dew of the sky and from the fat of the earth, and nations will serve him, etc., etc.
Mm-hmm.
No land, no children. What does it turn out? Turns out Isaac actually never intended to give the blessing of Abraham to Esau. When Isaac thinks he's blessing Esau, he doesn't give him the blessing of land and children. He doesn't give him the blessing of Abraham. When does he give the blessing of Abraham? Only much later, after this whole Esau-Jacob thing has come to pass, and now Jacob's getting ready to flee because he knows that as soon as his father dies, Esau's going to kill him. Right before he leaves, when his father knows fully who he is, what does his father say? If you look at the very first verse of chapter 28, right as Jacob's about to leave, and Isaac calls to Jacob and he blesses him and he commands him and he says, don't take a wife from the children of Canaan, which is exactly Abraham's instruction to Isaac. Go to Paddan Aram, to et cetera, et cetera. And then if you look in verse 3, what is the blessing he gives
now
him?
May El Shaddai bless you and make you fruitful and multiply so that you multiply you so that you will become an assembly of peoples, and may he give you the blessing of Abraham to you and your seed with you that will make with you that you may take possession of the land of your sojourn, which God gave to Abraham.
That's the blessing of children and land, and he explicitly calls it the blessing of Abraham. Isaac always intended to give the blessing to Jacob. We know that because he didn't give it to Esau when he thought it was Esau, and he gives it to Jacob when he knows it's Jacob. Isaac always intended to give Jacob the blessing. The tragedy is that Rebekah and Isaac did not talk this out. They didn't communicate as partners. They prayed in separate corners. They did not discuss their children together. And Rebekah and Isaac actually never say a word to each other, at least that we have. The Bible never reports a word said between them ever again throughout the rest of the text. Talk to your partner. I mean, we can get so wrapped up in our own personal faith journey and our own personal relationship with God that we can forget, like so many characters in the Bible do at some of their lowest moments, that this is a communal endeavor. We're doing this together. And I think this is one of the realest moments in all of Genesis, maybe in all of the Bible, where you realize that so much of this pain could have been avoided just by talking to each other. And when you, and like you said before, like these are real people. Isaac, there is no character in all of ancient literature, in mythology, in any other of the false, no other tradition of wisdom has characters like this. These are the realest characters. I mean, it's Isaac and Rebekah struggling to raise children, to have a family, to have a good relationship, to communicate as partners. I mean, what could be more real than this? Like, this is when you read the Bible and you're just like, this book is amazing.
And it's an interesting concept that Abraham's journey starts with him leaving a place and going to this land that God had promised, and kind of the beginning of Jacob's evolution is leaving the promised place and going away from it.
Oh, it's a great point.
To be able to return.
Yes.
And so sometimes it's about going to the promise, and sometimes it's about being taken out of that promise.
And trusting that God will bring you back.
And trusting that God will bring you back. And so it's not just, as simple as, okay, well, I'm here and I stay. But there's always a part of God's journey, which is either bringing you into something or taking you out of something so that you can actually grow and develop into who God wants you to be. Because Jacob's story, which we will track now and we'll go through in later episodes, is a challenging one. He's going, running away, and he's going to face a series of challenges, which will ultimately, in a roundabout way, bring him back. But it brings him back with so much more purpose that he would have not understood. And again, what we see is God is working with a failed humanity and the poor choices they make, but he's taking our poor choices and somehow he's using even our bad choices to fulfill the story, because he's ultimately going to redeem and restore. So it's that redemptive quality of God going, okay, if I was
I
to,
know what I'm working with here.
yeah, I'm not working with much, but I'm working with them, and I'm gonna have to. But you're gonna see what I'm gonna do, and so, I look at Jacob's story in a lot of ways of like, okay, day one of creation, it's not that impressive from a standpoint of like, wow, I could live here. This is good, right? It's like we got some light and we got a lot of water.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like this place. I'm going to be swimming for a while, God.
It's good.
So, yeah. And we look at Jacob and we look at the beginning of Jacob's story and we're like, oh, what are you going to do with that? And again, it's like this idea that the way God has started from the beginning is it's not going to be day one where you see the finished piece. It's not going to be day two. It's not going to be day three. It's going to be the entire journey, a 7-day period, if you like, of me seeing the glory of what I'm about to create, but you can't see it. And now you're going to have to track with me, and it's going to look like it's a disaster in so many steps of the way until it's finished. And now you and I would look at Jacob and be like, wow, well, Jacob becomes an incredible figure and someone who is wise and really kind of someone that, why is Jacob name?
The nation and land of Israel is named after him.
Like to this day, when you and I are sitting in the land of Israel,
right?
Because of, the beauty of what God was able to do with Jacob in the period of his life, which now far extends him. And Israel will now become, or Jacob will now become the entire representation of an entire group of people that, which is interesting because you got Abraham, who's the father of faith, Isaac, who's the promised son, and now Jacob, who's going to be the father of a nation. And Jacob, so often now in the text, when God refers to Israel or the people of Israel, he'll just refer to them as Jacob.
It's worth talking through why that is, right? Like, why is Jacob the one?
Why not Abraham?
Yeah.
Why do we not live in the land of Abraham?
Right. Now, you could say, well, Jacob's the only one all of whose children stay on the path, right? So it's kind of like by default. But, I mean, you could, listen, we still revere Abraham. We still revere, Sarah, Isaac. You could have called this land the land of Abraham. I mean, it would have, in many ways, would have been more appropriate than the land of Jacob. Abraham lived here for longer, right?
And, other people groups probably would have been like, oh, we're okay with the land of Abraham. It's the Israel we have a problem with.
Exactly right. That wouldn't have caused any problems at all.
Right.
But I think like part of it is, if you think about what the name Israel means, I mean, we'll get to this in a future episode, but it comes from the story where Jacob wrestles with the angel and stands up to him and confronts that force, whatever that force is, confronts that force head on. So the word Yisrael means he fights with God, or he contends with God. You know what I mean? Whereas the name Yaakov, like if you look at the name Jacob, if you look at the beginning of the story of Jacob,
twins. We're in the verse 24.
Yeah. Oh, right. So exactly. So verse 24, they have Rebecca has twins. They come out. The first one is ruddy and red hair, gingy, etc. So they call him Esau. The question of why his name is Esau is, well, we get back to in a moment. But after that, Jacob comes out, like Jacob's grabbing onto Esau's heel, and the word for heel in Hebrew is akev, and so his name is Yaakov, right? Which we transliterate as Jacob. So Jacob means heel, but it also that root akav also means like to trick or to preempt, right? So Jacob is the one who kind of wins through not unsavory means, but kind of like can hack the system,
trickery,
right?
Yeah.
Whereas the name Israel is confronting somebody head on, right? So what happens to Jacob throughout his life is that Jacob begins life as kind of like almost like a con artist,
like a deceiver, yeah, in the background, and he ultimately becomes someone he
grows and he becomes someone who still has that sense of wisdom and insight and canniness, but is actually willing to confront problems head on and stand on principle. And what that means is that of all of the early figures in Genesis, of all of the patriarchs and the matriarchs, Jacob's the only one who radically changes throughout his life. Right? Abraham is a man of faith from the beginning. The first thing we hear is he leaves everything behind and travels. He deals with challenges and he has to overcome them or not overcome them, but he has Isaac also. Isaac has the same challenge throughout his life he constantly has to struggle with, but Jacob is the one who goes from this place to that place.
It's the best story of transformation in the book of Genesis. In fact, I think
maybe in world history.
The transformation of Jacob's story is in that one. And so why does God elect to kind of focus on the nation of Israel and the Jewish people kind of coming under this banner of Jacob? Because just like Jacob had to go through such a journey to grow and change, then we too as people can relate to the reality of like, man, if God was to judge me or look at me as what I am now, I'd be like, oh, like there's hopefully something more that I can grow into, and the belief is that I will grow into that. And I think it's like encouraging to people, like wherever you are in your life right now, whatever challenges or obstacles that you think you can't overcome, there's a story, in the beginning of the Bible that talks about taking someone in, I would almost say in a fallen state, and making them into the man that they were always going to be. They just couldn't see it yet. And so that redemptive, transformative kind of experience that we read through with Jacob is something comforting to us, because it's like, wow, where will I be in 10 years if I choose a path that pursues God, and so the potential of what we can become is kind of the story of Jacob.
Yeah. And it's always that question of not just like, I guess, what can I become, but how do I use the things I'm good at now that I may be using for evil or for unsavory ends, and use those things for good, right? So Jacob, it's not just that Jacob doesn't like radically transform from one person to a completely different person.
No.
He's still the same Jacob, right? Because that early thing that he has with him, even at that immature stage, is he's always thinking about the future. So we talked about a second ago. He's always thinking about the future. What God wants from Jacob and what God plans for Jacob is that he's going to grow into a person with that same belief in the future.
Same belief in the future, but to do it with a way that has integrity.
Exactly.
And now reflects the character of God.
Exactly.
Because ultimately, what is this all a pursuit of? If we go back to Genesis 1:26, we are created in the image of God. And thus, to understand what that image is, first we need to know who God is, and then we need to start shaping ourselves to become more like that image, not less like that image. And so, the pivotal moment of Jacob wrestling with God, which we're going to get to, is what I think we're all doing in some sense, right? We're wrestling with who God is, who I am, how do I fit into God's story, and how do I understand me fitting into God's story is I think the constant tension that even to this day I find myself in. You wake up and you're like, what am I supposed to be doing?
Right.
Like I had a dinner with some Jewish folks a week ago, and I love talking about the Torah and the Tanakh. And I think Jewish people are always amazed at my knowledge.
It's true. I've seen it.
And they're like, wow, a lot. Like, are you sure you're not Jewish?
Should I go back and read this thing?
Yeah. And so this guy said to me, what's your purpose? And I was like, it's a good question. It's always a hard question, especially when you're at a dinner table and everyone's watching. And I said, I said to glorify God. That's how I kind of, and it was very obviously it's quite a generic answer. And he said, no, you have a gift. Don't waste your gift. And it was just a conversation, maybe he says it to everybody, right? But whatever he said really got me thinking, and you're like, there are gifts that I even not boastfully would say, but I know I have a genuine love and curiosity of the text more than most. It's difficult, like we said at the beginning of this episode, sometimes to read the Bible. I love reading it. And I hate reading books, Ari. Like the first book I read cover to cover was ironically the one that I've got in my hand. But for whatever reason, I have a gift in reading the text and sometimes pulling things out that other people don't see. And when this guy said, you got to go for your gift. There is something that God has created inside of me, but it requires me to first see it, understand it, and then pursue it. To actually get to that final place. And if you do get to that place, then you have the potential to have a real shift in your story like Jacob. Like you say at the beginning of your story, he did have a gift of, future thinking, generational thinking, and even to that is in the sense of he thought long past even maybe his own life, but it took God to bring it out and bring out the best of him. But when it did, you're like, wow, what a blessing it is to read the stories of Jacob and know that God can do something with figures like him. Because again, we go back to our own reality. Like, what do you want to do with me? What is my gift? Where should I go? And what do I become in 10 years if I pursue that? Not just go, okay, yeah, well, it's cool. I love reading the Bible, but like whatever, so.
I remember it was, I had this moment once where I was talking to my grandfather, who was my teacher, and I was supposed to interview him for like the university newspaper because he was a major theologian. People wanted to know what he thought, and the topic of that issue it was like a kind of like an intellectual kind of like Jewish Thought magazine. Topic of that issue was something like the religious value of pop culture. And I remember going to my grandfather and saying, hey, can I interview you? People want to know what you think. He goes, oh, great, sure. What's the topic? I was like, the religious value of pop culture. He's like, oh, that's such an easy interview. There isn't any, right? So like, and like he loved MASH, he loved Everybody Loves Raymond, but like he wasn't a pop culture guy, right? And the truth is he was right. I couldn't fit in his pinky toe in terms of ability and goodness and virtue. But what I did recognize kind of subsequently and kind of thinking about that event is, for whatever reason, I always loved TV, music, pop culture. I felt drawn to it, and I still do. And it can be destructive because it can be a time waster, and it can draw your focus, and it can expose you to all sorts of things that are just wasting your time and energy. But at the same time, I have felt over the course of my life that, you know what, to the extent that this is something maybe not unique about me, but something that I really personally enjoy and feel called to, how can I use that to bring goodness into the world, to sanctify God's name? How can I use my unique skill sets and talents to actually bring godliness into the world? And it's a question that too few people ask, because there's this kind of sense that the path of righteousness or the journey of faith is like the same, and it's just up to you to like walk it, and it's a drag, right? But like there's this old movie, Chariots of Fire, where you have this unbelievable runner, and he has this great line where he says, every time I run, I hear God's name in the wind whistling past me, right? Where people are created with those unique skill sets and talents. And actually, God wants you to use those things for his glory. And that's the challenge we have, like figuring out how to use those things for good.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's like, you meet people who love numbers. I hate numbers, but I'm glad there's people who love numbers, because who's going to do my taxes? And so it's like one of those things.
That's what Jews are for.
Yeah, yeah. I don't even know if my accountant is Jewish, but you know what? That's something I'm going to have to investigate.
Exactly.
But it's like everyone has been given a unique gifting in God's story, and although certain figures in the biblical text are highlighted, it again shows that like everybody's all making up the pieces of this puzzle, which I'll probably reiterate the whole time as we walk through Genesis, it's still God's story.
Yeah.
Isn't it? The consistent theme through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob up until this point is God is in control. And even if he subliminally hides that sometimes, like with the conversation with Rebecca, He knows exactly who's going to be chosen.
Yeah.
He knows exactly where this is going. You know, one of my favorite verses in scripture is Isaiah 46:10, where Isaiah 46:10, where God says, I declare the end in the beginning.
Mm.
And so we don't know what the end looks like, but God has already declared it. And he does this in a way because he's actually challenging, you know, these false gods who are claiming some sort of supernatural power. And he's like, okay, well, they're not like me. And I'm going to give you the best example. I'm going to declare the end in the beginning. Try that. Let's go with that. And so why is the book of Genesis such a powerful text? Just based off of understanding that God says, I declare the end in the beginning. Well, this is the beginning of God's story with humanity. So many of the things that he is declaring in this book are actually going to be a confirmation of what the end will potentially look like.
Well, I love that you cited that verse because if you look in the Hebrew in Isaiah 46:10, so it's I declare the end from the beginning. The word for beginning there is reshit. Right, Magid me reshit acharit, right? I declare from the very beginning, the end. That word for beginning is the same word that's used at the very first word of Genesis, reshit, bereshit, right? It's the same word. What God here is saying, and by the way, Isaiah has so many references to Genesis. God's saying, if you want to understand how history is unfolding, your personal history and the history of society and civilization, read this book. It's there from the very beginning. It's there from the first chapter of Genesis.
Yeah, it's there.
Yeah.
So don't start in the book of John or Matthew if you want to go. If you want to upset I am.
Isaiah says, start in Genesis.
Genesis. The end is there.
Exactly.
And it's also the beginning. Okay, so question. We're going to finish off with a question. Since we've got to Jacob and we've gone through Genesis, if you had to choose one of the patriarchs to be and to live their life, which one would you choose? Abraham, Isaac, or Yaakov?
Oh my God. Okay. So question, do I
You live their life.
I live their life, meaning like I
nothing changes.
Nothing changes. Woof.
What would you pick?
Oh my God. This is gonna be
controversial.
I think I'm going Isaac. Do you know why I'm going Isaac? I can't stomach the excitement of the other two.
Right.
Like,
yeah. I think to myself,
I'm a simple man, a simple
yeah,
taste.
you know, but I think actually I would also probably lean towards Isaac because of the stress-free nature. Like you got Abraham and you got like, the dilemmas of like, I'm the first one. What happens if I'm crazy? Yeah. Like, you know, and then you got Jacob and he's got 2 wives who are competing for his attention. He's got 12 kids.
His father-in-law hates him. His brother's trying to kill him.
Yeah, like it does feel like Isaac, despite everything, is the guy you're like, well, you know what? It's not too bad. There's one event that I think I want to bring up because before we close this out, I'm interested in it.
By the way, hit us up. Who would you choose?
Yeah, leave it in the comment section if there is even a comment section here. Which patriarch would you choose, or matriarch as well? We should let's open it up to the ladies. You know, Team Isaac, right? Stress-free.
Exactly. Just stay in Israel.
Short and sweet. No major issues. I just have a couple of dilemmas with Abimelech. So I want to ask about this Abimelech. You know, we cut back to Isaac having to have a covenant with Abimelech. Now, remember an episode ago, Abraham made a covenant with Abimelech. Yep. Correct me if I'm wrong, but is this an example of the difference between the covenantal ideas of God and the covenantal ideas of man? Because God makes a covenantal relationship and it's consistent. And then we see Abimelech making a covenant with Abraham, which seems like it's going to go for generations. And then all of a sudden, Isaac, 1 generation later, has to reestablish a covenant with Abimelech because with man, nothing lasts.
You know what's interesting?
Or am I just wrong?
No, I think you're right. And you know why that's... You know the easiest way to see that? So Abimelech seems to be, much like Pharaoh, not a personal name, but a title. It just means my father the king, right? Or my father is king, whatever it is. But it's a title. It's clearly like some sort of like ancient Canaanite title. And the name Pharaoh, like Pharaoh is not a personal name, it's a title, right?
Mhm.
Like the pharaohs of Egypt. Much later in biblical literature, the Bible will tell us the names of the pharaohs, so like Pharaoh Necho, etc. But by the way, archaeologically speaking, Egyptian sources will refer to pharaohs by name later on, but specifically in the second millennium, right? End of the second millennium, when the Exodus takes place, that's when Egyptian sources are not referring to pharaohs by names. So Exodus is in so many ways just Exodus clearly is set. It clearly knows exactly about the time when the Exodus takes place. So annoying scholars who are like, so much later. It's like, guys, it's not.
It's not. No.
But
no, it's not at all. It's actually quite accurate to where it falls.
Extremely accurate. And in ways that only could have been possible at that time. Anyway, but because Abimelech is a title, so we kind of have to ask yourself is, what is the significance of the fact that the Bible typically refers to, at least in Genesis and the 5 books of Moses, why does the Bible refer to these leaders as if they're all one person? Like, even though it knows and we knows and it wants us to know that they're different people. I think the answer is because it's precisely what you said. There's something inconstant about man's ability to commit and to last. And both at that time when the Bible was given into the world and now, there's so many sources of authority or seeming authority that are competing for our attention. There's politicians, there's celebrities, there's whatever it is, but then there's God. And you have to ask yourself, like, which one's going to be there, not just at the beginning, but also at the end. And I think there is a sense in which the Bible just wants us to say, like, all these leaders, like all these very powerful people, each one of which was the most powerful person who ever lived in their time, they're just all the same. And there's something banal, there's something boring about it. Like, they're just all the same.
Yeah.
And you can
don't expect anything amazingly surprising about, a man, Yeah.
But God, that's something worth relying on.
Because that's where the consistency is, you know. And there's a tendency for us to want to, like, try and find something in a man.
Yeah.
Right. Like we're looking for leaders and we're looking for politicians and we're always like, there's got to be someone who can do what God requires of us. But even in the Genesis stories and these figures, as good as Abraham is, we see his failings. As good as Isaac is, we see his failings. As good as Jacob is, we see his failings. And we're coming to the reality quickly that without God, man is in a state of despair. That it's really a story of, like, his man who you are and who you want to kind of, I can do it, I'm the best, and the failings of that, and then his God who will actually be the best and consistently come through with the promises and the declarations that he makes to the very end. And so again, God declares the end in the beginning, and what's his first declaration? This is my story.
I love it.
Yeah. Thank you.